Well, I lived several different places before I came to Minneapolis. I grew up in Michigan. I traveled around Europe and the States. I lived in Los Angeles and Savannah, Georgia, and New York. And so by the time I just sort of landed here accidentally, I thought that maybe I needed to see what it was like to develop roots and really sort of ground myself into a place and become part of a community. And so I started to explore the art scene, which didn't immediately lead me to Northeast. I Rogue Buddha used to be someplace else, way down Hennepin and such, but I got involved in the Art Collective, which is it was an art gallery in the Thorpe Building, and that was the first time I started to hear about all of the strange buildings in Northeast where, they look from the outside like empty warehouses. They look sort of imposing and industrial and like there's nothing interesting at all going on inside, and people would say, oh, we'll meet us at the California building, and I would have no idea what that meant. And then I started to uncover what's going on here and what's been going on here, which is just this really vibrant arts community. And when I found that, I wanted to be deeply involved. I'm pretty into advocacy in a lot of different forms, and so I got involved in NEMA. I actually coordinated Art Whirl a couple of years in a row. That's a lot of work. So props to NEMA and their continued work on that. But and I was also on their board, and then I don't know. Then I got a studio in the Northrop King building, and later now I'm actually in the California building, and I got to know the artists, and they're interesting. They're dynamic, and they're coming up with all these unusual things that that they like to talk about, and I started to photograph them. It was initially a very slow process. For about 5 years I was photographing really, really slowly. And then I got a Minnesota State Arts Board grant. And, thank God for the arts funding here in in this state. It really does help push things forward and get the artists moving. And so I got to photograph a lot more, and at first it was a gallery show, and then I thought, well, I always thought of it as a book, and I've always thought of it as interviews. So then I went back to the people I photographed and interviewed them, and got another State Arts Board grant to do that, and photographed some more people and interviewed them as well. And it's just fun. It's nice to force interesting people to sit down with you for an hour and hear their story. Well, hear their stories and how they got to do what they're doing and why. And I just think it's compelling. And in some ways too, I think there was a small piece where I was searching to see if there was some sort of maybe artist formula, perhaps. Was there a path that seemed to lead more often to success in terms of the arts? And that's blatantly not the case. There's very little overlap. There were a few things, like they are pretty willing to take risks, jump in the pool with no water, and they're pretty good at being frugal. But yeah, other than that, they're all kind of divining their own path. And so I got to record it, and that was that was amazing and fun, and I want to keep doing it.
So, how far back does this obsession with getting under other people's skins go?
Well, I mean, I think I partly became a photographer because it's the opportunity to, explore just a slice of a person. I like photographing what exists, more documentation than necessarily a heavily photoshopped creation. I don't have any problem with that at all, but I love the world as it is, and I really love seeing the faces and extrapolating the stories in one way or the other, and it's become more and more that I want to hear that story and have that go along with the imagery.
That going along is really interesting to me because I don't do that piece. I mean, this camera will not move. It will take hundreds, thousands of images, but with no intention behind it. So how do you find the interview and the photography working together?
Well, it was sort of interesting because in a lot of them I was going back. So in some cases I was getting an earlier slice of a person, and then that relationship either really coincided or it became a historical document even within the small time frame of the photograph versus the interview. Like, for example, Craig Bell, who's in the book. I photographed him in his studio, and he had been in the Northrop King forever. He was one of the first. It was, a very empty building when he first got there. He and Shannon Joy Potter and just a few others were kind of navigating these empty halls. And by the time I interviewed him, which was a year later, he had actually given up painting. And that transition of the artist in his studio who had been painting for so long and who had just such an enormous body of work, beautiful work, he seemed very free. It seemed like he was he's very at peace with stopping. And so the story was interesting, and it was interesting to kind of pair that freedom of just, I'm letting go of the stress of always having to create, against this image of, a painter proud on his stool with all of his supplies near him. And so, this historical documentation, as it relates to each point, with photography being such a single slice, I think is really interesting as well.
So, how do you think when you're doing a photo shoot of an artist? And how do you stage it? How do you get ready for it? How do you stage it? What kind of calls do you make as you do it? How long does it take?
Well, the shoot usually takes an hour. The interview usually takes an hour. One interview took me 3 hours. That was with Lori Svedberg. I think the shortest interview was maybe 30 minutes. It's kind of like I'll take what I can get, what they're willing to give me. I do light everything. I go in with my strobes and design the light because I feel like it helps to underscore certain aspects of the individual that I want to pull out. It separates them from their surroundings a little bit, and kind of helps to show the facial structure and helps to show the person a little bit better. So I kind of take over their space, and I've always shot them in their Northeast space, either in their working space or in the studio where they show. And so they're surrounded by all these things that they create in more of a natural way. And then I'm able to show that as well. So, but I did turn all the images black and white because some of the artists, the colors that they work with and such, I found to be a little bit, distracting. It's more about kind of the person, and the rest was kind of the ambiance that's created. Although there were a few that, like Randy Walker's, that I was just like, oh, I have to take the color away from this. It's so beautiful the way it is. So.
As you're talking, the image that's coming to mind, and I don't know whether I think it can't be actual footage, it's got to be the recreation in the movie of Annie Leibowitz's shoot of Queen Elizabeth, which was this person who desperately did not want to put on all this stuff, wanted this to be over, right. And the photographer insisting that this is the only way you're going to get the photo that will live forever here. So it's like one queen confronting another about these things. It was a wonderful. I mean, you could give her to Helen Mirren the Academy Award just for that. So, do you find force fields interacting with other force fields when a photographer goes after a visual artist?
What's funny, I'm not gonna necessarily name any names, but there were a few people that were not necessarily happy with the way that I photographed them. They didn't present the way they wanted to be presented, and then there were some people that were unhappy with what I chose from the interview, because we did these very long interviews, and then I called the pearl, what I saw as the jewel that really spoke to me, that said something genuine about, making things, about art, and about the process of being an artist, and that wasn't necessarily always what they wanted to do. So, it is tough, because you've got what I consider to be, you've got these two creators that have ways that they like to present, and whose voice is it ultimately, and for some they had trouble that it was mine. But I did also want to, one of my goals is to show them and to support them and to get their names out and get their work out and get people interested in what's going on in this community and what's going on with these artists, and to be compelled by the story to go during Art Whirl and kind of find these artists. And it's interesting. This is kind of off subject, but it was funny because there was one time I was kind of visiting the different artists during one of the art crawls, and I had them selling my books in their studios, so it was kind of a way to get the books out there. And there was a woman who had got one of my books from an artist, and then she went to a different artist and wanted to have them. She was trying to collect signatures, like an autograph book of all of the artists. And the other artist said, "Oh, well, that's the the person who did the photography, that's the person who wrote the book. And she said, oh, and then turned back to the artist, so she was completely uninterested in me at all, which it was funny, but and fine. I really didn't have a problem with it. I thought it was really interesting that in some ways I brought the artist so much to the forefront that in some ways I sort of disappeared into the background, and they could take center stage like that, which is good. I'm glad for that.
Bring you an honorary plasticized card in the Invisible Persons Club. It's a great group. We can meet almost anywhere. They don't have to reserve a table for us.
Right.
Oh dear. Well, I have a funny relation to people who don't like stuff I've done. It's really interesting because, of course, you can't call your stuff back, but I can. If they don't like it, I'll remove what I can from circulation. On the other hand, they don't have quite the same lines that the people, they can't blame me. I don't edit. They can't say I did a bad image because there was no selection. So people are sort of faced with a sort of existential crisis, and they end up sometimes saying something rather like, I don't like myself. I don't like how I came across 5 years ago. Or sometimes, I don't have my line down yet. It's an interesting thing. Some of the best things that have ever gone through this camera have been withdrawn. So I sort of have, sometimes I wipe them, sometimes I keep them in a secret little file to look at myself.
Right.
But basically, but it's very interesting, that process.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and the thing of it is that I wish that they understood how dearly I love them. I mean, the reason why I put them in front of my camera in the first place, or I interviewed them, was because I find them so compelling. And I still do, regardless of their opinion. And there weren't many, but the opinion of the final, the final outcome. But it comes from a place of, I hope that this exposure will help you, and I hope that you can see what I'm seeing in this piece that I pulled out, and and I didn't really edit the images, and it's okay if you're not perfect looking, because we're not. So, can you do a shoot with somebody you don't like? Oh, yeah. Sure. But for my own projects, I don't have to.
I see. You don't choose to do that.
Right. I mean, I shoot a lot for... I shoot a lot for a lot of different clients. And honestly, I think I discovered how much I love the story and how much I love this editorial style of photography through years and years and years of working for the Minnesota Women's Press. I freelance for them pretty regularly. And, oh my goodness, the people you meet and the stories that you hear are just mind-blowing. You talk to an 89-year-old woman who was one of the first doctors in Minnesota, and she tells you a story about how she would do home visits and do home births, and how were these crazy, almost wild dogs in the background, and she just took the placenta and threw it over her shoulder to the dogs. And, that's compelling. I mean, it gets you on so many different levels, and so through that and just like that dialogue, it's like I want to go deeper into this, and I want to go into the community that I've been involved with for so long, that has embraced me as one of their own, and that I've worked with in countless different ways, and I want to show them off. I want to allow them a voice. So.
So, in your own work at least, what you're doing is celebratory and not sort of objective, examples horrible. Whatever you do, don't become like this person.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't shy away from humor. I think we all need to be willing to poke a little fun at ourselves. But yeah, absolutely, I would say it's definitely more of an accolade to the people in the book and to the people that I photographed. And there were a ton of people. Money just disappears so fast, and there were so many people I wanted to include that I didn't have a chance. And it's like, oh well, now I want to do another one. Maybe we could do a whole series of them. I mean, there's more than the number keeps growing. I can't keep up with it, but I think there's more than 800 artists in Northeast Minneapolis now, and I have 37 in the book. I shot 50. It's just a scratch of the surface of the voices that are here. And even the people in the book, there are some who no longer have a studio, who have gone on to other things. So it's constantly changing, and it's already, it's a year old, it's already a historical document.
So have you always worked with this combination of photos and interviews? I mean, when you work with the Women's Press, for example, are you writing the stories that come?
No. They always have a writer, and the story is always written, not always, almost always written before I photograph them. And usually they actually send me the story so that I can understand how to create the photograph, what sort of mood to put into it, what sort of details to have in that visual that go along with the story. But I can't help myself. I get in the conversations anyway, and then I'll usually send them a little bit more of a tagline that goes along with it. I'll say, this, they told me this and this, and then Norma always says, thank you, I loved that little extra bit of information that you gave us. So and then there's a ton of work that I do that really has nothing to do with that. I just did some photography for a publication called the book is called Smart Steps, and it's just activities for 3 to 5 year olds, and it's showing them how they can use their bodies. So there was very little interview in that. It was more about how can I get this moment, how can I get this thing happening within the frame.
So you have a range of work from stuff that sort of puts food on the table to creative projects that. Yeah.
Well, and I teach as well. I teach over at the Art Institutes International in Minnesota, and I teach about 2 days a week, and the rest I'm doing personal projects or I'm doing commercial work, and the teaching is wonderful because you're always looking at the world through this lens of the fresh new photographer who's excited by everything that they're doing, and it helps keep you excited, me excited as well, and looking at things in a fresh new way on a pretty regular basis.
So is the mix pretty much right for you at this point between teaching and commercial projects and personal projects? I mean, are you reasonably happy with how the balance is?
Mostly. Sometimes it's a bit chaotic because that's a lot of balls in the air in a pretty on a pretty regular basis, and so sometimes it's like, oh, I'm missing something over here because I was so focused on this other thing over here. So occasionally it's chaotic, but for the most part, I kind of designed it that way. It was like, I don't want to teach full time. I don't want to do commercial work full time. I want to, I don't necessarily want to do my own personal projects all the time. I want to see these different pieces because I think they're each kind of adding to each other and they're helping me grow in this holistic way as a photographer.
A few years ago, I did a piece with Lori Pickett, who was a People magazine photographer, who, when she broke out into documentary film. She did a piece on her uncle, who was an original ice-capades guy and
Right.
has the biggest collection of ice-capade stuff in the world. And it was kind of fun to hear how she. But I'm always interested in how people choose, as it were, where to stop in their creative stuff. You stop before you get to voice. That is, you can get interviews, but you can't get the voice.
Right.
And Lori, although she started also as a still photographer, decided she needed the voice, and went on to documentary film. So, do you ever feel temptations to take that next step?
Right. Well, I guess part of it is that I've always liked to take time to sort of really examine each detail. And so far, and who knows, this could change, but for me, a photograph that's still, that allows me to look at each piece, that's, it gives me a couple different, it gives me some freedoms that I don't think that I would necessarily have in terms of film. First of all, each frame, people are constantly moving, and I can look at all these frames that I've made, and I can kind of pick, I can kind of choose, well, which one best represents how I see that exchange and how I see that individual. And so in some ways it gives me a little bit more freedom of choice in that way. And that's kind of the same thing too with the interviews. I mean, I culled them down to probably about 300 words out of a hour-long interview. And so, trying to get that cleaned up and perfect through a sound bite is nearly impossible, but on a written page, it's much easier. And I think there's some interpretations there that you're allowed. You can kind of filter it through your own history, what you're bringing to the photograph in a lot of ways. And so the viewer, the photographer, and the subject all leave their own imprints on the image and even on the text. And I think that that's just such an interesting collaboration.
I'm curious about your teaching and about, well, a couple things. One is, I'm sure there are certain things that anybody who teaches photography does. Just otherwise you're not teaching photography, you're teaching something else. And so I'm curious about sort of what you bring that maybe not everybody brings to a class in this sort of thing.
Well, I really like teaching the end classes where they're working on their portfolios and really sort of designing their style and their voice as a photographer. And I like to believe, and maybe I'm wrong, that I am able to remove my own personal biases from that process and instead be a guide. so that they're not becoming sort of little mini Sarah photographers as they walk out the door, but instead they found the place that makes them the happiest. And that could be anything. In photography, there's this sort of weird hierarchy, and I try to break that apart a little bit. It's like, oh, well, the artist photographer's on top, and then it's fashion photography, and way down here at the bottom is wedding photography, and that's not necessarily true. I've seen former students make absolutely phenomenal wedding photographs where they're really being creative and interesting and dynamic, and it was like, you figure out what makes you happy. You figure out what kind of images really truly speak to you, and then you do that until you break through into your style and into your voice, and then see what happens.
Another thing I'm curious about is how do you recognize talent?
Well, I mean, I have been surprised by, students who are kind of going one way, and then they there's a piece, there's something that opens up, and then they move off into this other direction, and so I try not to necessarily judge that too early, but there's usually an innate love of light and a good sense of color, and a way of kind of allowing the photograph to speak without falling into cliche. That's what I'm usually looking for, and when they get there, it's pretty cool.
I've been thinking a lot recently about face blindness, which curiously is a problem I have, which is why there's a camera between us,
Right.
so I don't have to pretend to see your face, which I don't. I won't recognize you at the supermarket tomorrow.
Right.
And on the extreme end, you have conditions like Asperger's and so forth. Now, is it your experience with photographers that they are kind of the opposite of that a photographer is particularly tuned in to things like the nuances of faces?
Well, I'm not particularly good at recognizing people either. I forget names and faces, and it always mortifies me. So I think that sometimes I rely too much on the camera to remind me of who people are, and maybe that's what destroyed it for both of us. I don't know. But while it's going on, while you're looking through the lens, and you see the gesture, you see how suddenly the area around the eyes relaxes, or the genuine smile come out, and it's like, yes, here we are.
Yeah. So in the moment, yes, but then not necessarily in the memory.
Right.
Well, I've been really wondering, because it strikes me that it could go either way. I mean, one of the reasons one does things with cameras is because one's no good at doing it with one's brain cells. Right. And so
yes, I've always wished for a better memory, but yes, we have so many things that can do that for us now.
Yeah. It's a fascinating thing. Whether one's profession is a compensation for one's disabilities or a play to one's strengths.
Right.
Probably there'll be all sorts of mixes of that, and different photographers with different strengths.
Yeah.
So as you were, telling your story, you emerged onto the stage as a photographer. You were, as a photographer
Fully
who
formed.
wandered, fully formed. It was like one of those rock thingies that floats around and finds a rock to attach to. So photographer attaches to Northeast Minneapolis.
Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, when I was in maybe 5th grade, my dad let me use the big camera, and I took a picture of my sister and my mom and my dad. No, I must have been younger than that. But I took a picture of them at the Lincoln Memorial, and then I thought about that picture for years, and I thought, as soon as I'm old enough, I'm going to get on the yearbook staff, and I'm going to be a photographer for the yearbook. And I was. And then I got into college, and it didn't seem like a very practical, I didn't even really think about it because it wasn't practical, and I was thinking about psychology, and I was thinking about this and that and the other, which actually I think photography and psychology are closely linked, and art. And so I kept trying different things. I was trying philosophy, which also I guess doesn't pay that well. And I was, trying all these different things. And finally it was like the only thing I kept going back to, the classes I was taking for fun and I just kept going back to, was always photography. And I sat myself down one day. I fully remember this, though my memory is bad. I remember this. And I said, okay, if you're going to do this, it's going to be hard. And you gotta do it fully, and so that was it from then on out. I got out of college, and I was fortunate enough to have some family support, and I got to travel. So I was photographing through Europe and through the States for about a year. I started to run out of money in Los Angeles, where I got a job at Berliner Studio. And we were not paparazzi, let's be really clear, not paparazzi, but we were hired to shoot premieres and the after parties. We were asked to be there, and so I shot a lot of celebrities. And then I thought, well, I kind of want to go get my master's. And it wasn't to teach necessarily. I didn't have a goal. I just felt like I needed to learn more about my craft. And so then I went to Savannah College of Art and Design in Georgia, and then I got an internship with Joyce Tennyson in New York, and I was out there. And then I had a friend who was here who said, there's a lot of work here, you should come here, come shoot for my magazine. And so I'd never been to Minneapolis or Minnesota for that matter, ever in my life. And I just showed up, and and then it just kept going from there. So yeah, my full adult life, I've only ever done photography, and I dread to think how I could transition into another field at this point, because I don't think I'd know what I was doing.
But I mean, you came by it from decent places. I mean, you came by it from philosophy. You came by it from psychology. You came by it from all sorts of richness of ideas.
And I tell my students that as well. It's like, you can't just look at photographs in order to think about photography. You've got to look at literature, and you've got to look at other art forms, and you've got to be thinking about concepts. And that's what makes the images richer, ultimately, is because they have these different levels. Not everybody is necessarily going to see all of those, but there's, the subconscious still attaches to those, and that's how some of the best photographs are made, is to have, these layers of, just additional richness, additional sort of background, us as a culture, to respond to.
As you were talking about after parties, I was remembering, just because I looked at it recently, the first chapter in War and Peace, which is a giant party with all sorts of very important things happening that won't show up as important for about 300 pages.
Right.
And sort of like, it's very important that you see what's going on here and here and here, or you will, you'll miss everything.
Which is true of life. I mean, every single thing that we've experienced has led us to this point, has led us here. And so, they are all important in our journey. And I think, I love it when literature does that, which most of the best literature does, because it underscores this idea that you couldn't have gotten here without having gone through, the chaos and the loss and the joy of your previous selves.
Are some faces more interesting than others?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's the faces as much as it's kind of the willingness to be open to the camera. It is actually very easy to choose to shut yourself down in front of the lens, because you don't want to be photographed. You don't want to be there. And if you're not present, if you're not kind of willing to let go and have this experience with the photographer, then the pictures will feel a little bit dead. And so, just that willingness to be open is more important in some ways than the actual facial structure, because you can just see, you can see the light in the eyes and the vibrancy that's there, and that connection is kind of what we yearn for, whether we're looking at a photograph or having a conversation or anything. It's knowing that you're not alone, and so to be given that connection, to be offering even that connection kind of through that lens, is vulnerable, but it ends up feeling honest.
One of my favorite painters, locally, Lois Romberg, tells about hiring models for figure classes. She says, you can hire models over the phone. You don't need to see it. And she's talking about just what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Are they willing to be there? Are they willing to show up, not just physically, but emotionally show up and, and be there? And sometimes as a photographer, you have to be the one to kind of pull them out and to get them to stop worrying so much about how they're presenting themselves, and just, how can you get that honesty to start flowing through? And sometimes you can work your butt off and it never comes. And
yeah, I know what you mean. One preoccupation you mentioned as we were talking about your book and talking about what you're looking at is this matter of, the way I'd put it is, who has a tiger by the tail and who has a mouse or hamster or something by the tail. Who has a project that's going to take them to some interesting places, who's going to be able to keep growing. And I know your initial statement was, you can't tell, there's nothing obvious. But even a small amount of light on that particular topic is worth an enormous amount. I'm wondering what your thoughts are at this point.
so you're more asking like the artists themselves and who...
Well, you've been around creative folks in various connections for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
You've had students, you've done your own creative projects, you've had colleagues, and you focused on visual artists. So, what have you noticed that might be helpful about staying power?
Right.
And and deepening engagement
Right.
and non-hackness and all that sort of stuff.
Well, I think part of it is really discovering what is the real connection you have to the work that you're making, you know, and oftentimes that'll start pretty early on. So, you know, Chank is the first person in the book, Chank Diesel, and he's a font designer. And it's sort of like, well, you know, how do you fall in love with font? Like, why is that so compelling to you? It's just kind of an unusual medium, and it's very specific. And if you talk to Chank about fonts, he will speak about it in ways that you've never heard of a typeface being talked about before. He'll talk about canyons and prickles and, you know, these points and how, you know, how he relates to the typeface in this very visceral way that makes you look at font differently. And you know, he mentions in the book too that he's like, you know, he did not create Comic Sans, but he says, you know, I really love Comic Sans. It's weird and quirky, and it's good. It's fine that it exists, because it actually does, you know, it opens up other things. It has opened up other things, and you know, I've heard jokes about Comic Sans my whole life, and so to hear somebody actually say, "Good job, Comic Sans," was you know, it was fun and interesting and a new way to kind of view it. And he talks about how he was a lefty, and so his writing wasn't very good, and so so he'd have to stay after school and practice his writing, which he actually loved doing because he had 1 million brothers and sisters, and it was the one peaceful time of day that he had. And so he found a refuge in writing the same you know, the same letters over and over, and so that became kind of this peace, this place that he found solace and joy. And so I think kind of connecting to that, there are points in our history that shape us more than we necessarily always realize. And so that exploration of how did we get to here? Why am I so, you know, why am I so interested in this? Why do I keep coming back to this over and over and over, and exploring that, and then accepting it as well, and saying this is what I need to be doing. This is how I need to be spending my time. And I think that shows staying power, because it's simply that same thing that just keeps calling you and just keeps pulling you back and pulling you back.
And you don't ever experience this yourself as a sort of demonic possession.
Not so far. Not so far, but I mean, I have known, you know, it does seem sometimes like people are more driven in the sense that they are not really in control of the process. They have to do it because they have to, and they're not given a choice. But I think that the people that don't kill themselves over it usually also find joy and, you know, a sense of, you know, this is where I can retreat to. So.
Well, I was just remembering your story about the painter who felt a certain relief at not painting any longer.
You know, but honestly, his was more, he had translated it, and this is the tough piece, is that he had translated it into sales, proof of his worth by how many pieces he could sell. And the tough thing is that we do have to make a living, But when we get so obsessed with,
Sure.
I am worth something because I can sell, that's when I think people get into an uglier place. And so, you know, the art world is a great way to show off the artists, but I've heard many people say it's a bit like, you know, being a zoo animal, you know, that you're sort of on display, and it's tough seeing all of these people go back past your work and not necessarily connect to it. And it's partially because they just went through a million other studios, and now they're, you know, they've zombied as they've gone through, you know, all these places. And so, you know, it's a delicate balance of getting your work shown, getting it out there, and being able to sell and being able to make a living and survive, but not getting so obsessed with the sales that you're almost more doing it for them as opposed to you. And so that's, I don't know, that's, I think, the one of the toughest challenges for artists is, how do I make a living and still ensure that I'm going into this pure space and doing it for the reasons that really, you know, that really connect with me. But I think also, you know, sometimes you move out of that particular phase of your life and you're ready to be at a different place. You know, I haven't ever lost the connection with photography, but I've watched my work change pretty considerably. I mean, when I was an undergrad, all my images were so romantic. And then for a while they were so sarcastic, and, you know, they change as we're at different points, and as we're kind of viewing the world through a different lens. We see that, you know, how we're making that work reflects where we're at.
So is it important to you to have a cash cow?
You know, I guess that's partly, you were asking before about the balance, the fact that I'm teaching and then I've got my commercial work and then I've got my personal projects. And I think that's part of why that works for me, is that I don't have to make every single person fall in love with what I'm doing as my personal work, so I don't necessarily ever have to kind of sell out on that. I can do it for me and for my goal set, but I can also help support my kids and the house and, you know, my husband, and I can feel like I'm, you know, contributing. And again, you know, that commercial work helps teach me a lot, and the teaching helps teach me. I'm getting something out of all of these pieces, and so it's lucky that some of them generate revenue, and that others, you know, they generate some revenue, but that's not the primary goal.
One of my favorite artists out in Wyndham survives by running the local Hallmark store. And so, I mean, the artistic thing about, besides, you know, choosing the right stuff there, the artistic thing about running the Hallmark store is the flower arrangements. And then he has the time, but he has, as it were, a totally separate cash cow with very little crossover to his work. We started, and of course, being in Northeast, in the middle of Northeast, we started thinking in this interview about this matter of being rooted, putting down roots, and the difference between traveling to lots of interesting places and settling into some place. You've had now some time to settle in, and you've been pretty aggressive and intentional about the way you've settled in. What do you know about rootedness.
Yeah, I've been here for 16 years now, which is, it sort of takes me by surprise when I think about it. I was like, yeah, I think I've been here for 10 years. No, it's 12. No, it's 16. I think it has its pros and cons. I mean, I was traveling so much before I got here, and there was a fair amount of, it was very freeing to just kind of experience something and have that initial just perfect relationship with everyone around you. As they get to know you better, they get to know your quirks and you get to know theirs, and not all of them are always pleasant. And so, that was really easy. I would leave before getting into that deeper level. But again, I didn't have that, stronger connection. And I really enjoy the community here. I really enjoy the artists. I like seeing how their work is growing and changing, and how their experiences are affecting what they choose to create and how they choose to create it. And you can kind of see the line a little bit more, and you can see kind of the background, get the background information on them as well. And the story about Craig Bell and giving up painting is so interesting, because it's not just that story. It's also his daughter, Megan, who she also has a space in the Northrop King, and she got into painting because her father was, and she sort of took over a portion of his studio for a while, and then finally moved into her own space. And she talked to me about what it was like to see her dad give up what had defined him for so long. And then she talked about the fact that, her kids now see Northrop King as their second home. That they're all the time. And so you see these generations. And I don't think I could hear these stories, and I don't think they would be as open with me if I hadn't put in my time, if I didn't actually root into the community, and if I didn't allow it to be important to me. If I was just coming in as a stranger, I don't think that they would necessarily respond as well. And so, there's a richness there that is allowed, that isn't as sparkly and fresh as when you're just kind of flying through, but it's certainly more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. So the kind of photography and the kind of documentation you do in your book, you couldn't have done without being rooted in this community. It would have been something different.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it's funny because people always, when they're trying to explain about photographers and why it's nice to be one, they talk about fresh eyes. And the images of somebody who flies into London, gets a good night's sleep, and takes a day.
Yeah.
But it's the older eyes that you're after having.
Yeah, I like to tell a piece of advice I often give my students is you need to photograph what you know. And then I'd like to give this slightly embarrassing story about myself. It was very shortly after I'd moved here, and I had never seen an ice house in my life, and they were so weird. And we were going up to a shoot up north, and I saw them out the window, and I was like, what are those? There's a whole lake of them. And some of them have curtains. And that's so cool and weird. And so I was like, I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna photograph those because they're amazing. And so and at the time I was really interested in 4x5 photography, which if you're familiar with it or not, it's a huge camera. It's film, and it's heavy and cumbersome and massive. And you have to load in one picture at a time, and just to like focus it and line everything up. It takes a while. It takes a while to take one frame. And I drove 4 hours out there to the same lake that I had seen. And I got out there, and there was nobody there. And I was cold. And I had this huge camera, and I think I took 2 frames, and I loaded it back up, and I drove 4 hours home. And it's because I didn't have a connection with that community. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't bother to do my research. You know, I didn't do the things that you need to do in order to get a deeper, more thorough unveiling of a culture. And so yeah, it was a big failure. And I think it's important to recognize that when we have this connection, when we have this understanding, and when we have a relationship and a commonality, a common ground, that's the time when we can get past, again, that surface, right? That shiny little surface of the new, and go deeper into it and kind of show the richness and the depth.